Very appropriate that we join in worship this morning with our Anabaptist brothers and sisters around the world who began worship. In particular, my heart this morning is drawn to our brothers and sisters who are worshiping in Friendship Park this morning on either side of the wall. National Park, where it's open on Saturdays and Sundays, and on Sundays the Border Church with Pastor Guillermo on the Tijuana side leading a service in conjunction with persons on the other side of the fence. They stand and they sing together, acknowledging the same spirit in which we claim our common identity as brothers and sisters in Christ. Moriah and I will try to be somewhat coherent this morning, at least I'll speak for myself, in our reflections, having just arrived home late last night. We have a number of other places in which we will share our stories throughout this next week and month. So bear with us this morning as we try to hold the pain and joy and craziness we experienced this past week. And if my tears are all that I have to share this morning, I think that'll be enough. I'm deeply grateful this morning for you as a community because I know that you hold this pain as well. And so as we went this past week, we really felt your spirit with us. We didn't have to explain why we're going. You get it. Fills me with hope to be reconnected to the ancient traditions and scriptures, as we read this morning in Leviticus. We're called to live out the same values of justice and compassion as we are today. This is a rich legacy and heritage that we draw from. So we are not alone in this struggle. And it's as we step into the mess that the Spirit shows up to empower, to sustain, to guide us along the way. But I think we first need to sit with the pain. To not be afraid to stare into the ugliness of a racialized system and its many manifestations. To do the necessary inner work of being transformed into a people more fully aligned with the kingdom of God. One of the scriptures running through my mind this past week was from John. That we are no longer called servants, but friends. And you will hear us using this language intentionally this morning, referring to those who are seeking to cross the border as friend. In our training on Monday with a group of about 20 other individuals from all across the U.S., we were asked to reflect on the names and phrases we use and we hear to talk about those who are traveling across countries and borders. And I think we're well familiar with the inflammatory and xenophobic rhetoric used by many in our country and administration, but we also need to be very careful about using language such as immigration crisis. Calling immigration a crisis feeds punitive policies. Fact is, the border crossings are not surging in that they're at near historic lows, and they're not a threat to us. That's not to say that nothing serious is happening. For families traveling in the migrant caravan, the situation is a crisis. The decision to leave one's home due to life-threatening violence and poverty can never be undertaken lightly. But the way we have treated them as a nation is creating a moral and humanitarian crisis. My first encounter with our friends came on the San Diego side, where they were taken from a detention center and dropped off by an ICE bus at a nonprofit organization called Rapid Response. And on that first evening, about 90 persons were released there, all families, mostly mothers and children, with nothing on them except their clothes on their backs. The children, from newborns to teenagers, hung close to their parents. And having no idea where they were coming from or how much they knew of us, in receiving them, we were instructed to move at the pace of trust as we reached out to them. They are at an incredibly vulnerable and tender place at the mercies of strangers around them. And perhaps what was most poignant to see was the black bracelet monitors bound around their ankles to track their every move as if they were criminals. Yet what I saw was a desperate and resilient love of a parent, a child, and the hope of a new kind of life. I saw my family in them. I heard the same names of my children. I saw our shared humanity. I saw weary faces bearing the tension and fear of many days and months on the road. Yet, there was also incredible moments of joy. Some of them were picked up by long-lost friends and family stateside. Later in the week, I learned more of their life stories from the Tijuana side, and Moriah will share more about those stories in helping file their stories for later credible fear interviews and asylum claims. Indeed, the shark's mouth, the phrase we heard in the poem earlier, hardly begins to name the realities which some of them come from. These are our friends. And I am deeply grateful for their resilient and courageous faith in the face of such daunting challenges and pain. Our faith at its heart is a story about a love that will take great risk, an incredible journey to be with us. And this is the story we are invited to live out day by day with our friends near and far. As our hymn declares that we will sing later on, we are strangers no more, but members of one family.
Right on the border, on the Tijuana side, working in welcoming people as they came into our office, and also doing what they called accompaniment, which is there's a little tent that is set up right next to the border where our friends need to come to get their number, and then they wait there until their number is called, or they wait somewhere in Tijuana and then come back and wait for their number to be called. Some days 2 numbers are called, some days 50 numbers are called, and you never know. And so we wait with them and stay with them in that waiting. First, 2 funerals. One day when I was in the office, a friend from Mexico came in, a woman about my age, and she started to tell me some of her story. She had been living in the U.S. as undocumented and was deported. And her father had just died, and she was trying to see if she could get back across the border to be there for his funeral with the rest of her family. I didn't know if we would be able to help her, and so I passed her on to some of the more experienced people in the office. And we planned for a clergy accompaniment to try and regalia could get her across the border. It didn't work out at first, and so I thought that it wasn't going to happen. But the next evening, as we approached the actual line on the border, they make you go through this long kind of pathway that you walk up, and then you walk around, and then you walk down, and then you walk some more, and then you get to turnstiles. And there's a line on the ground there that says Mexico and a line in the USA. And we got to the turnstiles, and one of the workers that we were working with, he was actually a young guy from this community who grew up around here, and his parents go to community Mennonite. He was standing there with this friend from Mexico, and her sister was on the other side with some documentation to try and prove that father had died. There was a funeral. Could we get her across? So I went with 2 other people from our group through American immigration, looked for the sister. In the meantime, she had come back through to the Mexican side and had come back to this friend. So we went back across into Mexico and back through all of it. And then I stood with her as we stood at the turnstile arguing with American immigration officers to see if she would be allowed to go to her father's funeral. And they didn't let her in. And so then I walked out with her sister as she left to tell her family that she was not able to come to the funeral. And as I sat in the complexity of this woman's story, I also sat in the complexity of the system that we're caught in, because the officers that we were working with, because of the government shutdown, they weren't being paid. And they still were very gentle with us. But I also kept talking about the power of my little blue book. My passport allowed me within 30 minutes to go into the US, into Mexico, and back into the US. And they were joking with me, but they wouldn't let her go to her father's funeral. Second funeral. A friend from Africa was in the office and got a phone call that his father had just been killed by the men that he was fleeing from. So some of the workers sat with him in his grief and in the realization of what had happened. The next day, we planned to hold a memorial for his father. Grief is excruciating. Imagine that grief without anyone who knows you and no family. I was given the task of preparing the space. Our office was maybe the size of 2 of my offices, but rough walls and just the space that we could be in to try and welcome people and work with helping prepare them for crossing. We searched around. I found some cleaning towels that I laid down over a table to make as a centerpiece. And I laid out my stole with the flowers that we could find. And we decorated a cross. We shared a sacred space with people who had no faith, people of different faiths, and people of deep Christian faith, holding a space so that this man was not alone and we could remember the life of his father. The words from the 23rd Psalm ring in my head. You prepare a table before me in the face of my enemies, in the presence of my enemies. I want to tell you about 2 men. An older friend and a younger friend from the caravan who had been traveling together for months. They were like family to each other. These 2 men came to the office every day and helped us with hospitality. They welcomed us with open arms. They cleaned the space with us. I served numerous cups of coffee with them and offered food to other friends who came. I walked several times with the older friend to find tamales and water. He had no English and I had very broken Spanish, but he would do the bartering and I would carry the cash. And a younger friend who helped me decorate for the memorial service. We took branches of eucalyptus leaves and rubber bands and wove them around the cross. And then he went and got a box of tissues and he made little white flowers that he wove into the cross. We joked together and we showed each other pictures of our lives. And we would drag other people over to translate for our conversations. One afternoon, we had an almost karaoke-style concert in the back of the office, and he sang to us songs from his own home and culture. And 3 of us eked out 606 for him. One day when I came back from a particularly difficult accompaniment, he hugged me and comforted me while I cried. And as we talked, we used Google Translate. I would type into my phone and hand it to him, and he would read and then type in and hand it back. And I started to learn about his life and his story. This friend has about 2 more weeks left until we think his number will be called. And I am terrified of what detention will do to him. We heard a Leviticus passage read today that's been going through my head. When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself. For we were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And 2 families. The older of the friends that I just told you about had a wife and a daughter, and we waited with them 2 different days while they waited for their number to be called. The first day, it came right up until their number, and their number was not called, and they would be called the next day. And this friend walked over, and again, we didn't share a language, but he went, yes. How are we calming ourselves in this waiting? As we did walk them to the gate the second day, the younger friend who had been traveling with this family for months stood on the line as far as he could go with them and sang his heart out. And then he turned and fell into the arms of one of our volunteers, weeping, as those of us who could approach more went up to the gate with the family. The second family that I spent a lot of my time accompanying, I met on the first day that I was put on accompaniment. I went up to them and we started with doing some ballet positions together. When you're working with little kids, you figure out how you can play in any language. The daughter was about 12. We moved from there into some finger games so that I could play with the 6-year-old brother. And as I built a little bit of trust, the oldest, the 15-year-old brother, said, I speak some English. And so for the next 2 days, we talked some, and he would translate for his siblings. They were traveling just with their mom. We brought them back to the office as they were waiting for their number to be called, because we thought it would be called in the morning, and then they were told it would be called in the afternoon. So we brought them back to the office to wait. The daughter took some of the crayons from the games and children's section and pretended to play the drums that were in our office, and I accompanied her on air guitar. We taught them how to play Go Fish, and we tried to explain to the 15-year-old the difference between I'm boring and I'm bored. The oldest son asked me what it would look like when they would call their number and take them. And I explained what would happen, and I told him that I would watch him and be with him as long as I could. The mother said that my eyes would be on them, and then they would be in the eyes of God. We waited in this slow, fast transition with them, standing, waiting next to the fence, then quickly being put in a line, and then waiting, and then quickly having to say all of our goodbyes, and then being taken inside the fence, and then waiting, and then being put on buses and being taken to where they would be processed. One of the fears for this family was that the younger children would be taken and that the 15-year-old would be separated and treated as a single adult. This 15-year-old with his cheeky smile and his playful eyebrows. We helped them carry all their belongings, knowing that most of the people coming out on the other side had had everything taken from them. I stood there as they got to the lowest piece of clothing they could get to, so they're like under t-shirt, and would write phone numbers on that, because generally they won't take whatever piece of clothing is closest to your skin. And as they stood there in front of their children, making them memorize a phone number so that they could contact each other again. The youngest son tried to push the strings on his sweatshirt up into the hood to hide them so that they wouldn't be taken, because their belts and their shoelaces and any strings are stripped from their clothing. When they were taken to the other side of the fence, the 6-year-old ran back over to me and through the fence handed me a piece of gum. That was the same day that Trump announced that folks coming across and claiming asylum would be sent back to Mexico. And people were devastated. But there was also just hordes of cameras and people reporting. And the folks that we were accompanying don't want their photo taken because it can jeopardize their lives. And so for the last 15 minutes of waiting, this family that I had worked with had their hoods up and were standing with their backs to us to try and protect their faces, as we tried to tell the photographers that they did not want their photos taken. Many of our friends still talked about their hope in God. I told one of them that I was mad at God. And he responded that God is the only one that they can trust in all of this. He must hope in God's justice because he has nothing else left. I think of the Leviticus passage. I am the Lord your God. These stories feel incomplete because they are. They are just a tiny snapshot of thousands who are caught in this system.